Well, deafening silence from many in the mainstream media after Ben Carson, renowned pediatric neurosurgeon, is brutally attacked in several circles for voicing his opinions, many of which happen to sound conservative. Here is some of the interview I had with him when he came on this program, and we talked about the subject on Tuesday.
They feel that if you look a certain way, then you have to stay on the plantation. You know, I've heard some people refer to me as an Uncle Tom. Well, obviously, they don't know what an Uncle Tom is because they need to read Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. You'll see that he was very, very subservient, kind of go along to get along type person. Obviously, that's not what I'm doing. And what the left frequently does, and some aspects of the right too, is they try to make life so unpleasant for anybody who disagrees with them that people will keep silent. And I know that it's working because so many people come up to me and say, thank you for having the courage to express this. This is the same way I feel. But most people won't speak up. I'm trying to get people to speak up because, you know, this country is changing into something else. And we need to make sure that we really want it to change into something else and not just end up there and ask ourselves, how do we get there?
So where are all of his defenders, as he is called, a token, an Uncle Tom, an Oreo? Joining me now to discuss it, Mark Thiessen. He's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a columnist for the Washington Post, and former chief speechwriter for President George W. Bush. Also, Camille Charles, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Let me start with you on this, Mark. You know, many on the left, especially these days, are not slow to jump to accusations of racism when, you know, most people would say, how'd you get there, right? It doesn't take much for them to sound that alarm. But when you actually have people saying he's an Oreo, he's a token, he's an Uncle Tom, and dismissing him outright because he happens to be black and has some conservative views, deafening silence. Why?
Well, I mean, he predicted it. It's shocking. And look, if you go back to that speech he gave that launched him into national prominence at the National Prayer Breakfast, he talked about the need for more tolerance in our society. He talked about the need for us to respect the views of people who disagree with us. He talked about how the PC police are trying to muzzle people. And so how does the left respond to that? They call him an Oreo and an Uncle Tom and a token. You know, they're doing exactly what Dr. Carson predicted. So it's, in a way, it's not surprising. But what they don't seem to understand is that the reason conservatives are drawn to Dr. Carson is not because of the color of his skin. They're drawn to him because of the content of his character. They love his life story about how he grew up in poverty in Detroit, how his mother raised him and didn't let him make excuses, and how he became this leading pediatric neurosurgeon who separates Siamese twins. I mean, this is an amazing man. And so the people who are fixated on the color of his skin are the people on the left. Who are calling him all these racial epithets. I think it's kind of sad and pathetic that they're doing it, and it's sad that nobody's coming to his defense except you.
What is that, Camille? I mean, why would anybody be calling him a token at all? Why, if they don't like his message, right? Then go after his message, right? But why get into Oreo and token and Uncle Tom? Doesn't that suggest those uttering those phrases themselves have a racial prejudice?
I think one of the things you have to think about is the way that identity politics work. And even that statistically, you know, the lion's share of African Americans are left-leaning. And so, you know, there is a political element to this. And I think that really it's unfair, I think, at this point to say that it's the left that's going after him, because the things I saw were really other African Americans going after him. And again, it's not right, but it's also not uncommon. And I think Dr. Carson was correct when he said that it would be predictable and that these things would happen. And I think it really comes out of political differences and differences in belief, not about this ideology of personal responsibility, because that has a long history in the black community. I think it really has to do with other policy-related things that Dr. Carson said in his speech, and that it comes along, and he really comes along on the political stage at a time when the right is trying to expand or you know, widen the tent and bring African Americans in, which then leads African Americans to be somewhat suspicious and to assume that that this is a move really to get African Americans interested in the GOP, or at least to have the GOP start to look more like the rest of the country.
You know, but let me ask you, Mark.
Hold on,
I want to get everybody in, but let me ask you, Mark, because you know Barack Obama came to national prominence back in 2004 when he made that great speech at the Democratic National Convention and inspired everybody. I mean, if you had people coming out and saying he's a token, what an Uncle Tom, you know, or talking about him as an Oreo back then, and I'm not saying that he has not been subjected to racist insults, because he has, the left would have gone bananas. But this guy happens to be more conservative sounding. I've never heard him really describe his politics with a broad brush, but he has a lot of conservative ideals. And it's amazing to me that the normal people who would be expressing outrage are the ones leveling the charges. Not just that they're silent, they're the ones saying tokenism.
No, imagine if this started with a commentator on another network. Imagine if a commentator on Fox News had said the kinds of things he said about Barack Obama. There'd be outrage across the country about it. But you go on the other network and it's left-leaning and you say these things about a conservative and it's all right. And look, it's a combination of a couple of things. Is one, there's intellectual laziness on the part of the left. You know, when conservatives try to offer free market alternatives to the permanent welfare state and talk about opportunity, they dismiss it as racism. But they can't dismiss Dr. Carson as racist. So they call him a token or an Uncle Tom because it's their way of getting around it. They try to portray the GOP as being anti-science. Well, here you have a prominent pediatric neurosurgeon, a man who operates in the brains of babies, this great scientist who is espousing conservative ideas, and so they don't know how to handle it. He's a threat to them, and so what they do is, because they don't have an intellectual answer to what he's saying, they throw out these epithets at him, and it's really a sign of intellectual weakness on the part of his critics.
And Professor, excuse me for calling you Camille before, but Professor, let me ask you about it, because is it, you know, wouldn't it be smarter and better for those in the black community? You know, you point out it wasn't, and it's not just the black community, but there has been a lot of folks on the left hurling these accusations. I'm not going to get into exactly who, but you know, some folks on a rival network have been really tough on him to say, look at this guy, look at his accomplishments, look at the example he sets for us as an American. Mark talked about his life story, about he pulled himself out of poverty, and even though his mother wasn't educated and got pregnant at 13, he made it. You know, he made it to Yale. He's the head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University, separated conjoined twins. Why not say we embrace him and we celebrate him? We may not disagree. We may not agree with his conservative or his philosophical positions, but God bless. You know, what we need is more African Americans rising to such amazing positions and setting the example for other, not just black children, but white children as well.
Well, again, I think that in the African American community, we do that. You know, I had famous black American flashcards as a kid, and Dr. Ben Carson was one of those people. And I think that we do that. That doesn't mean that we always agree on political issues. The African American community holds Colin Powell in very high esteem. They don't necessarily agree with his politics. I think those are two different things. And again, I think it's unfortunate, but I do think one of the other issues here is that for whites on the left to come to the defense of Ben Carson and tell black people what they ought to think gets you into another thorny circumstance. Again, I don't think that it's fair for anyone to be criticizing a man for his beliefs. I think that you know, that we can agree.
Yeah, you can say you disagree.
That there's diversity in the community, right? And that some blacks are conservative. And in fact, socially, many more blacks are socially conservative than I think we tend to think about, because we think about the way that blacks vote. And again, overwhelmingly, they vote Democrat. And there are sort of historic and real reasons for doing that then prompt them to respond the way that they are to Dr. Carson.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, as I said, but it isn't uncommon. And I think that hopefully moving forward, you know, we won't have this circumstance.
Yeah. I mean, you can't have, like, somebody like that just being dismissed as, and I quote, sadly, a token Negro. It's just patently offensive. I mean, it just is patently offensive. Listen, thank you both for coming on with your views. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.